understand what it was like to visit a medieval tavern, we must begin with the approach to the establishment. This approach would vary, depending on whether you were in a town or in the countryside, and whether you were traveling or whether the tavern was in your own community. Let us consider each of these scenarios in detail, as the context of your visit would significantly affect your experience. If you were a traveler approaching a tavern along a country road, you would first notice the sign hanging outside. Taverns in the medieval period used signs to advertise their presence, as most people could not read. These signs were typically painted boards or carved wooden figures that depicted the name of the establishment. Common names included the White Horse, the Red Lion, the Swan, the Rose, the Crown, and many others. The sign would hang from a post or bracket extending from the building, and it would creak and sway in the wind. The sound of the creaking sign would be one of the first indicators that you were approaching your destination. After hours of walking along muddy or dusty roads, the sight of the tavern sign would be welcome, as it promised food, drink, and shelter. However, the appearance of the building itself might be less impressive than you would hope. Medieval taverns were typically simple structures, often not much different from ordinary houses. They might be made of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, which was a mixture of woven sticks and mud or clay. The roof would be thatched with straw or reeds, or in some cases covered with wooden shingles or clay tiles. As you drew closer to the tavern, you would begin to hear sounds emanating from within. There might be voices raised in conversation or argument, laughter, the clink of pottery or metal drinking vessels, and perhaps music if someone was playing an instrument. These sounds would grow louder as you approached, and they would give you some sense of how crowded the tavern was and what sort of atmosphere prevailed within. The exterior of the tavern would show signs of wear and weathering. The timber would be darkened by age and smoke. The wattle and daub might be cracked or crumbling in places. The thatch, if that was the roofing material, would be darkened and compacted by rain and time. The overall impression would be of a building that had seen much use and that was maintained only to the extent necessary to keep it functional. This was not a place designed for aesthetic appeal, but rather a practical establishment serving a utilitarian purpose. You would need to decide whether to stable your horse if you had one, or simply tie it outside. Larger taverns might have a stable yard where horses and other animals could be kept, with a stable boy or ostler to care for them. Smaller establishments might have only a hitching post or rail where you could tie your mount. If you were traveling with a pack animal or a cart, you would need to make similar arrangements. The cost of stabling would typically be separate from the cost of food and lodging for yourself, and you would need to negotiate this with the tavern keeper or the ostler. If you were walking rather than riding, you would simply approach the door of the tavern directly. The door would typically be made of heavy wooden planks, perhaps with iron reinforcements. It might be partially open, allowing light and air to enter and the sounds from within to escape more freely. Or it might be closed, in which case you would need to push it open yourself. The door would be heavy and would likely creak on its hinges, announcing your arrival to those inside. Before entering, you might pause to scrape the mud from your shoes or boots on a scraping stone or piece of wood placed by the door for this purpose. However, the interior of the tavern would already be quite dirty, so this gesture would be more symbolic than effective. The floor inside would be covered with mud, spilled drinks, food scraps, and various other debris, and your addition to this mess would be barely noticeable. If you were a local resident visiting a tavern in your own town or village, your approach would be different. You would be familiar with the establishment and its proprietors. You would know what to expect in terms of the quality of the food and drink, the cleanliness of the premises, and the character of the other patrons. You might visit the tavern regularly, perhaps daily, to drink ale and socialize with your neighbors. In this case, entering the tavern would be a routine act, unremarkable and familiar. However, for the purpose of this exploration, let us assume that you are a traveler visiting a tavern for the first time. This will allow us to examine the experience in detail, as everything would be new and potentially surprising to you. Let us now follow you as you cross the threshold and enter the establishment. Chapter 2. Entering the tavern. As you push open the heavy wooden door and step across the threshold, the first thing that would strike you would be the smell. The interior of a medieval tavern had a distinctive and powerful odor that combined many elements. There would be the smell of unwashed bodies, as most people bathed infrequently, and many would have been traveling or working hard before arriving at the tavern. There would be the smell of smoke from the fire, which would be burning in a hearth or fireplace, and this smoke would not always be entirely vented through the chimney. There would be the smell of spilled ale, which would be soaked into the rushes or straw on the floor. There would be the smell of cooking food, which might be appetizing or might be somewhat rancid, depending on the freshness of the ingredients and the skill of the cook. There would also be the smell of the floor covering itself, which would be rushes, straw, or simply packed earth, all of which would be mixed with spilled food, spilled drink, and various other substances. This combination of smells would be quite overwhelming to someone accustomed to modern standards of cleanliness and ventilation. You would need to breathe through your mouth for the first few moments until your nose adjusted to the atmosphere. However, medieval people were accustomed to such smells and would not have found them particularly offensive or remarkable. They lived in a world where strong smells were a normal part of daily life. The second thing that would strike you would be the darkness of the interior. Medieval taverns had few windows, and these windows would be small and would not have glass in them, at least not in most establishments. Instead, the windows would be simple openings in the wall, perhaps covered with wooden shutters that could be closed in bad weather. The main source of light would be the fire in the hearth, which would cast a flickering, uneven light that left many areas of the room in shadow. There might also be candles or oil lamps, but these would be used sparingly as they were expensive. Your eyes would take some time to adjust to the dimness, and even after adjustment, you would find it difficult to see clearly, especially in the corners and far reaches of the room. As your eyes adjusted, you would begin to make out the features of the room. The tavern would typically consist of a single, large room, though larger establishments might have additional rooms or an upper floor with sleeping chambers. The main room would serve as the common area where drinking, eating, and socializing took place. The floor would be covered with rushes, straw, or simply be packed earth. These floor coverings would be dirty and would need to be changed periodically, though this might be done infrequently. Walking on the floor would produce a rustling sound from the dry plant material, and your feet might occasionally encounter something soft and unpleasant hidden beneath the surface layer. The ceiling would be low, perhaps only 7 or 8 feet high, and it would be darkened by smoke from the fire. The beams would be exposed, showing the timber frame structure of the building. Hanging from these beams might be various items including hams, strings of onions, bundles of herbs, and other provisions. Spider webs would be common in the corners and among the beams, as no one would bother to clean them away. The overall impression would be of a dark, crowded, smoky space that was functional, but not comfortable by modern standards. The furniture in the tavern would be simple and sturdy. There would be tables, typically long trestle tables made of rough planks set on removable supports. These tables could be taken apart and stored when not in use, which was sometimes necessary to clear space for other activities or for sleeping. Around the tables would be benches, also made of rough planks. There might be a few stools as well, though these would be less common. The furniture would be well worn and would show signs of long use, with surfaces scarred by knife cuts, stains from spilled drinks, and general wear. The tables would not be covered with tablecloths, at least not in most establishments. The bare wood would be the eating surface, and it would not be cleaned between customers. Previous diners would have left their marks in the form of food scraps, spills, and grease stains. You would need to find a relatively clean spot to set down your cup and bowl, or simply accept that your dining surface would be less than pristine. The walls would be made of the same wattle and daub as the exterior, or perhaps of stone if the building was more substantial. They would be whitewashed or plastered, though the finish would be stained and darkened by smoke and grime. There would be little in the way of decoration, perhaps a few simple religious images or symbols, but nothing elaborate. The joint walls would serve a purely functional purpose, providing shelter from the elements and some degree of privacy from the outside world. The hearth would dominate one wall of the room. It would be a large opening where a wood fire burned, providing heat, light, and a place to cook food. The fire would be kept burning most of the time, as it was easier to maintain a fire than to restart one. The flames would cast dancing shadows on the walls and would create zones of warmth and cold within the room. Areas close to the fire would be hot, sometimes uncomfortably, So, while areas far from the fire would be cool or cold, especially in winter or at night, the tavern keeper would be somewhere in this room, probably near the fire or near a counter or board where drinks were dispensed. The keeper might be male or female, as women often ran taverns, especially if they were widows of previous keepers. The keeper would be busy attending to the needs of the various customers, drawing ale from barrels, serving food, collecting payment, and maintaining some degree of order in the fire or near a counter or board where drinks were dispensed. The keeper might be male or female, as women often ran taverns, especially if they were widows of previous keepers. The keeper would be busy attending to the needs of the various customers, drawing ale from barrels, serving food, collecting payment, and maintaining some degree of order in the tables, or standing near the fire. They would be a mixed group, representing various social classes and occupations. There might be local farmers and laborers taking a break from their work to drink ale and socialize. There might be craftsmen and merchants discussing business. There might be other travelers like yourself, seeking food and shelter for the night. The composition of the crowd would vary, depending on the time of day, the day of the week, and the location of the tavern. As you stood in the doorway, adjusting to the dim light and the smoky atmosphere, you would need to decide what to do next. Should you approach the tavern keeper and request service? Should you find a seat at one of the tables? Should you simply stand by the fire to warm yourself? The appropriate course of action would depend on the customs of the particular establishment and on your own social status and purpose in visiting. Chapter 3. Ordering drink. Having entered the tavern and allowed your senses to adjust to the environment, your first priority would likely be to obtain something to drink. Thirst would be a constant companion for medieval travelers, as walking or riding for hours on dusty roads would leave you parched. Even if you were a local resident simply stopping in for refreshment after work, your first action would be to order a drink. You would need to catch the attention of the tavern keeper and make your request known. This might involve calling out to the keeper, approaching the counter or board where drinks were dispensed, or simply waiting until the keeper noticed you and came over to take your order. The process would not be as organized or efficient as ordering at a modern bar. There would be no queue system, no designated order for service. The tavern keeper would serve customers based on a combination of factors, including who was calling most insistently, who appeared to be the most important or wealthy customer, and who was easiest to serve given the keeper's current position in the room. Once you had the keeper's attention, you would need to specify what you wanted to drink. The options available would depend on the type of establishment, its location, and the time period we are discussing. However, we can make some generalizations about what would typically be available in a medieval tavern. The most common drink by far would be ale. Medieval ale was quite different from modern beer. It was made from malted barley, water, and sometimes other grains, but it was not flavored with hops. Hops were introduced to England from the continent in the 15th century, and beer made with hops gradually became more popular, but for much of the medieval period, unflavored ale was the standard. Without hops, the ale would not keep for very long, typically only a few days before it began to go sour. Therefore, ale would not keep for very long, typically only a few days before it began to go sour. Therefore, ale was brewed frequently in small batches, and you would be drinking ale that was quite fresh, perhaps only a day or two old. The taste of this ale would be quite different from modern beer. It would be sweeter and less bitter than hopped beer, as there would be no hop bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt. The flavor would be grainy and might have various other notes depending on the water used, the skill of the brewer, and what other ingredients might have been added. Some brewers added herbs and spices to flavor their ale, including combinations of herbs, known as groot. These might include bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, or various other plants. The resulting flavor would be quite variable and might be pleasant or might be somewhat medicinal tasting. The strength of the ale would also vary. There would typically be different strengths available, from weak, small ale that might be drunk throughout the day to stronger ale that would be more intoxicating. The weak ale might be only 1 or 2% alcohol, while stronger ale might be 4 or 5% or occasionally even stronger. As a traveler seeking refreshment, you might request the standard ale of medium strength, or you might specify that you wanted strong ale if you were willing to pay more and desired a more potent drink. The tavern keeper would draw your ale from a barrel using a pitcher or jug. The barrel would be set on a frame or stand that allowed a tap to be inserted in the bottom. The keeper would place the pitcher under the tap and allow the bile to flow until the pitcher was full. The ale would not be clear and golden like modern beer. It would be cloudy and might have bits of sediment floating in it or settled at the bottom. This was normal and expected, as medieval brewing techniques did not produce clear filtered beverages. Your ale would be served in a drinking vessel, and the type of vessel would depend on the status of the establishment and your own apparent social standing. In a simple country tavern serving common people, you might receive your ale in a wooden cup or bowl. These would be simple turned wooden vessels, perhaps bound with metal bands to prevent splitting. They would be worn smooth by use and would be stained dark from ale. In a better establishment, or if you appeared to be a person of some means, you might receive your ale in a pottery cup or even a glass vessel, though glass would be quite rare and expensive. The vessel would not be washed between customers in the way we would expect today. It might be wiped out with a cloth, or it might simply be refilled for the next customer without any cleaning. The standards of hygiene were quite different in medieval times, and the concept of germs was unknown. People did recognize that shared vessels could spread disease, but the practice of thoroughly washing cups between uses was not common in taverns, where speed of service and economy of effort were priorities. You would be expected to pay for your ale, and the price would vary depending on the strength of the ale, the size of the serving, and local market conditions. Payment would typically be in coins, small denominations of foot, silver or copper. You would hand over the coins to the tavern keeper, who might or might not give you any change if you overpaid. Exact payment was preferred, and pris or win, you would be expected to know roughly what a drink should cost based on local custom. Haggling over the price might be possible, though the tavern keeper would not be inclined to reduce the price unless you were a regular customer or unless business was particularly slow. Once you had your ale in hand, you would need to find a place to sit or stand while you drank it. If the tavern was not crowded, you might easily find a seat at one of the tables. You would simply choose a table that looked relatively clean and sit down on one of the benches. No one would show you to a seat or ask whether the seat was acceptable to you. You would be expected to choose for yourself and to move if the seat proved unsatisfactory for some reason. If the tavern was crowded, finding a seat might be more difficult. You might need to share a table with strangers, squeezing onto a bench that was already occupied. This would be normal and expected. Personal space was not a concept that medieval people valued in the same way modern people do. Crowding together at a table or around the fire was simply the way things were done, and you would need to accept being in close physical proximity to people you did not know. Alternatively, you might choose to stand rather than sit, particularly if all the seats were taken or if you did not plan to stay long. You might stand near the fire to warm yourself, or you might stand near the door if you wanted to be ready to leave quickly. Standing while drinking was quite common and would not be seen as unusual or inappropriate. As you drank your ale, you would have time to observe your surroundings in more detail and to note the behavior of the other patrons. The atmosphere in the tavern would vary depending on the time of day and the composition of the crowd. Early in the day, the tavern might be relatively quiet, with only a few customers drinking and conversing in low voices. As the day progressed and more people finished their work and stopped in for refreshment, the noise level would rise. By evening, the tavern might be quite loud, with many conversations happening simultaneously, occasional bursts of laughter or argument, and general bustle and activity. The ale you were drinking would have a noticeable effect fairly quickly, especially if you had not eaten recently. Medieval ale was consumed at room temperature or slightly cooler, never chilled as modern beer often is. The flavor would be somewhat flat and yeasty, without the carbonation of modern beer. You would drink it fairly quickly, as letting it sit would allow it to warm further and might allow sediment to settle in ways that affected the taste. Drinking a full cup of medieval ale would give you a pleasant buzz, a slight lightheadedness, and a sense of relaxation. However, you would need to be careful not to drink too much, especially if you were unfamiliar with the particular brew. Ale that seemed weak might actually be quite strong, and the effects could accumulate quickly if you were not paying attention. Becoming drunk in a tavern full of strangers would be unwise, as it would make you vulnerable to theft or to being taken advantage of in other ways. You would need to pace yourself, perhaps alternating between ale and water, though water would not typically be available in taverns and would need to be specifically requested. The process of ordering and drinking ale, while it sounds simple, would actually be fraught with small challenges and potential pitfalls for someone unfamiliar with medieval customs. You would need to know how to get the tavern keeper's attention without being rude or too insistent. You would need to know how to get the tavern keeper's attention without being rude or too insistent. You would need to know how to get the tavern keeper's attention without being rude or too insistent. You would need to know what to order and how to specify what you wanted. You would need to know roughly what the ale should cost and to have the correct coins available. You would need to find a place to sit or stand without causing offense or getting into a dispute. And you would need to drink at an appropriate pace, enough to enjoy the ale but not so much as to become drunk and vulnerable. All of these small decisions and actions would require knowledge of local customs and social norms that a modern person would not possess. You would be making mistakes and committing small social errors constantly, and while most of these would be overlooked or forgiven, they would mark you as an outsider and potentially as someone who could be taken advantage of. Chapter 4. Ordering food. Having obtained a drink, your next priority might be to order food, especially if you had been traveling and had not eaten a proper meal recently. The availability and quality of food in medieval taverns varied tremendously depending on the size and location of the establishment, the wealth of its clientele, and the skill of the cook. Let us examine what you might expect when ordering food at a medieval tavern. First, you would need to determine whether the tavern served food at all. Not all establishments that served drink also served meals. Some taverns were primarily drinking houses where people came to socialize and consume ale or wine, and food was not part of the offering. Other establishments combined drinking with food service, and some inns focused primarily on providing meals and lodging for travelers, with drink being secondary. You would need to ask the tavern keeper whether food was available and what options existed. The tavern keeper might offer you a set meal, which would be whatever the house was serving that day. This would typically be a simple hearty meal designed to fill the stomach rather than to please the palate. There would be no menu to choose from, no options for customization based on your preferences or dietary meal designed to fill the stomach rather than to please the palate. There would be no menu to choose from, no options for customization based on your preferences or dietary meals restrictions. You would eat what was offered or you would go hungry. This lack of choice would be normal and expected in medieval dining, whether in a tavern or in a private home. Food was fuel, and while it might be pleasant if it tasted good, the primary goal was to provide sustenance. The meal might consist of a pottage, which was a thick soup or stew made from vegetables, grains, and perhaps some meat if you were fortunate. Pottage was a staple food throughout the medieval period because it was economical and could be made from whatever ingredients were available. A pot of pottage might be kept simmering over the fire for hours or even days, with new ingredients added as needed and portions ladled out as customers requested them. The vegetables in the pottage might include onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, lentils, or root vegetables like turnips or parsnips. The bontgat grains might include barley, oats, or pont wheat, though wheat would be more expensive and might not be used in a common tavern serving ordinary folk. If the pottage contained meat, it might be pork, mutton, beef, though more likely it would be the cheaper and tougher cuts that required long cooking to become tender. Chicken might occasionally appear, as would various game meats if someone had been hunting. The meat content would typically be quite small, just enough to add flavor rather than being a substantial portion. The pottage would be seasoned with salt and perhaps some herbs, but it would not have the complex flavoring that modern soups and stews have. Spices were expensive and would not be used liberally in a tavern serving common people. The flavor would come primarily from the ingredients themselves and from the long cooking process that melded the flavors together. The texture would be thick and somewhat gluey from the grains that had cooked until they broke down into a porridge-like consistency. Your portion of pottage would be served in a wooden bowl or possibly a trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread that served as an edible plate. The pottage would be ladled onto the trencher, and you would eat the pottage along with bread as it absorbed the liquid. Alternatively, the pottage might be served in a bowl made of wood or pottery, and you would be given a piece of bread on the side to eat with it. The bowl would be placed directly on the dirty table in front of you, and you would be given a spoon to eat with. The spoon would be made of wood or pewter, and would have been used by many previous customers. In addition to, or instead of, pottage, you might be offered bread and cheese. The bread would be coarse and dense, made from whatever grain was most economical at the time. It would not be fresh, as bread was typically baked in large batches and then consumed over several days until it became too stale. The cheese would be hard and salty, made from sheep or goat milk. A chunk of cheese and a hunk of bread would make a simple but filling meal that could be prepared and served quickly without much effort from the tavern keeper. If the tavern was more prosperous, or if you were willing to pay more, you might be offered roasted meat. This might be a joint of pork or mutton that had been roasting over or near the fire, or it might be fowl such as chicken or goose. The meat would be carved and served on a wooden platter or trencher, and you would eat it with your fingers, as forks were not common eating implements in medieval Europe. You might be given a knife to cut the meat, or you might be expected to use your own knife that you carried with you. Medieval people typically carried their own eating knives as cutlery was not provided by the establishment. The meat would not be cooked to modern standards of food safety. The concept of internal temperature and the danger of undercooked meat were not understood. Meat might be charred on the outside and raw in the middle, or it might be overcooked and dried out. The quality would depend entirely on the skill and attention of the person doing the cooking. Similarly, there would be no guarantee that the meat was fresh. In the absence of refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and medieval people were accustomed to eating meat that was somewhat high or that had been preserved by salting or smoking. Fish might also be available, especially on Fridays or during Lent, when Christians were supposed to abstain from meat. The fish would most likely be salted or dried fish, such as cod or herring, which could be stored without spoiling. Fresh fish would only be available in taverns located near the sea or near rivers and lakes where fish could be caught locally. The salted fish would need to be soaked in water before cooking to remove some of the salt, but even after soaking it would be quite salty. It would be prepared by boiling or grilling and would be served with bread. Vegetables as a separate dish would be uncommon in a tavern setting. If vegetables were served at all, they would be part of the pottage, or they might be boiled and served plain. The idea of seasoning vegetables or preparing them in interesting ways was not part of common cooking practice. Vegetables were seen as poor people's food, less desirable than bread or meat, and they would be prepared with minimal effort. The quantity of food you received would depend on what you paid, and on the generosity or lack thereof of the tavern keeper. Portions would not be standardized, and you might receive a generous serving or meager one depending on various factors, including your appearance, your behavior, and the keeper's mood. If you appeared to be wealthy, you might receive a larger portion in the hope that you would pay well and perhaps return as a customer. If you appeared poor, or if you had somehow offended the keeper, your portion might be notably smaller. You would eat your meal directly at the table where you were sitting, without the benefit of a tablecloth, a clean plate, or most of the amenities associated with modern dining. The table surface would be dirty and sticky from previous meals. Your wooden bowl or trencher would be stained and worn. Your spoon would be crudely made and might be bent or have rough spots. You would need to brush aside crumbs and debris left by previous diners to make space for your meal. The experience of eating in the medieval tavern would be quite different from dining in any modern restaurant, even a very casual one. There would be no ambiance, no concern for your comfort or satisfaction beyond the basic provision of food and drink. You would not be asked if everything was to your liking or whether you needed anything else. You would not be offered dessert or coffee after your meal. You would simply eat what was provided, and when you were finished, you would be expected to pay and make room for other customers. The quality of the food would be highly variable. On a good day with a skilled cook and fresh ingredients, the meal might be quite acceptable, filling and reasonably tasty. On a bad day with a careless cook and ingredients that were past their prime, the meal might be barely edible. You would have no way to know in advance what quality to expect, and complaining would likely do no good. You would eat what you were served or go hungry. Food safety would be a constant concern, though medieval people did not understand the concept in the way we do today. Without refrigeration or understanding of bacteria, food poisoning was common. Meat and fish could be contaminated. Dairy products would sour quickly. Vegetables might be dirty or infested with insects or worms. Water used in cooking might be contaminated. You would be taking a risk every time you ate a meal in a tavern, and digestive upset was accepted as a normal part of life. The time it took to receive your food would be unpredictable. If you ordered pottage that was already simmering on the fire, it might be served quickly within minutes of your order. If you ordered meat that needed to be cooked, you might wait an hour or more, depending on how many other customers were being served and what else the cook was doing. There would be no way to track the progress of your order or to complain about slow service. You would simply wait until your food appeared, occupying yourself with drinking ale and observing the other patrons. Chapter 5: The Other Patrons. As you sat in the medieval tavern, drinking your ale and eating your meal, you would have ample opportunity to observe the other patrons. The composition of the crowd would tell you much about the type of establishment you had entered and about the community in which it was located. Let us examine the various types of people you might encounter in a medieval tavern and how they would behave. The most numerous group would likely be local laborers and craftsmen. These would be men who worked with their hands, performing the physical labor that kept medieval society functioning. They might be farmers who had finished their work in the fields for the day and stopped in for refreshment before heading home. They might be construction workers who had been laboring on a building project. They might be carters or porters who had been hauling goods. They would be dressed in simple, rough clothing, probably quite dirty from their work. Their hands would be calloused and stained, their faces weathered and lined from years of outdoor labor. These men would typically drink ale, often in considerable quantities, and would engage in loud conversation with each other. They would discuss their work, complain about their masters or employers, share news and gossip about the community, and generally pass the time in boisterous camaraderie. They would know each other well, as they would be neighbors and would work alongside each other regularly. Their conversations would be peppered with local references and inside jokes that an outsider would not understand. Craftsmen who had their own workshops might also be present. These would include men like carpenters, blacksmiths, tanners, butchers, bakers, and other skilled workers. They would be somewhat better dressed than the common laborers and might carry themselves with a bit more pride and status. They would also drink ale and socialize, but their conversations might be more focused on business matters, on the quality of materials and tools, on dealings with customers and suppliers. They might form small groups based on their trades, with the carpenters talking together and the blacksmiths forming their own cluster. Merchants might be point present, particularly in a town tavern. These would be men who bought and sold goods, either locally or as traveling traders. They would be more prosperous than the craftsmen and laborers, and their clothing would reflect this. They might wear better quality wool, perhaps dyed in colors rather than the natural off-white of undyed wool. They might have leather boots rather than simple shoes or wrappings. They would be calculating men, always looking for an opportunity to make a profit, and their conversations would revolve around prices, market conditions, and portoisbrico, trading opportunities. If the tavern was located on a major road, there would be other travelers like yourself. These might include merchants traveling between towns, pilgrims heading to a religious shrine, messengers carrying letters or documents, entertainers moving from place to place, or simply people visiting friends or family in another town. Travelers would be identifiable by their dusty clothing, their travel-worn appearance, and the fact that they were not known to the other patrons. They would often sit separately from the locals, perhaps joining together at one table to share information about road conditions and to find some security in numbers. Soldiers might be present, particularly in times of war or if the tavern was near a military garrison or castle. Medieval soldiers could be a rough lot, accustomed to violence and not always respectful of civilian property or persons. They might be loud and aggressive, drinking heavily and looking for entertainment or trouble. Other patrons would be wary of soldiers and would try not to provoke them. As a traveler, you would want to avoid drawing the attention of any soldiers present. as they might demand to know your business or might simply harass you for their own amusement. Women would be present in the tavern, though fewer in number than men. Some would be there as workers, serving drinks and food, cleaning or cooking. The tavern keeper might be a woman, or the keeper's wife might be actively involved in running the establishment. Female servers would be subject to harassment and unwanted advances from male customers, and this would be seen as a normal part of tavern life. Some women might be prostitutes, either working independently or under the management of the tavern keeper. Prostitution was technically illegal in medieval society, but it was widely tolerated, and taverns were common locations for prostitutes to meet clients. Respectable women would rarely visit taverns alone. A woman accompanied by her husband might stop at a tavern while traveling, but a woman of good reputation would not generally frequent taverns for social drinking. If you saw women drinking in the tavern who did not appear to be working there, they would most likely be poor women, widows, or women whose reputations were already damaged. The presence or absence of respectable women would tell you something about the nature of the establishment. Children might be present, running errands for their parents, begging for scraps, or in some cases drinking along with the adults. The concept of childhood as a separate phase of life, distinct from adulthood, was not well developed in medieval society. Children were expected to work and to contribute to the household from a young age, and they were often exposed to adult activities and behavior. Seeing children in a tavern drinking ale would not be particularly shocking to medieval people, though it might be disturbing to modern sensibilities. Beggars might be present, either just inside the door or just outside, asking for alms from the customers. The medieval period had a significant population of poor and disabled people who could not support themselves through work and who survived on charity. These beggars would be a common sight, and most patrons would ignore them or perhaps give them a small coin or a crust of bread. The presence of beggars would be a reminder of the precariousness of life in medieval society, where illness, injury, or bad luck could quickly reduce anyone to destitution. Priests or monks might occasionally be seen in taverns, though this would be somewhat scandalous. The torch clergy were supposed to live soberly and avoid places associated with sin and disorder. However, not all clergy adhered strictly to their vows, and some enjoyed drinking and socializing as much as any layman. A priest or monk in a tavern might be there on legitimate business, such as traveling to a new parish, or he might be there for less acceptable reasons. Other patrons would likely show deference to clergy, at least outwardly, though they might gossip about clerical misbehavior once the clergyman had left. The interactions between these various groups would create the social dynamic of the tavern. There would be a constant hum of conversation, punctuated by laughter, arguments, the clink of cups, the scrape of benches, and various other sounds. The noise level would rise and fall as more people entered, or as some left. Occasional disputes would arise, perhaps over a game of dice, over a perceived insult, over a debt, or simply because someone had drunk too much ale and become belligerent. These disputes would typically be resolved through argument, with the disputants shouting at each other while others either tried to calm them or encouraged them to fight. Physical violence was always a possibility, and fights would break out periodically. These would usually be brief scuffles involving punching and wrestling rather than the use of weapons, though knives might occasionally be drawn. The tavern keeper would try to maintain order to prevent the establishment from being completely destroyed, but a certain amount of disorder would be tolerated as normal. As an outsider, you would want to observe these dynamics carefully and avoid getting involved in local disputes or taking sides in arguments. You would keep to yourself, drinking your ale and eating your meal quietly, not drawing attention. You would be polite if others addressed you, but would not volunteer information about yourself or your business. You would be aware that you were in a potentially dangerous environment where strangers were not always welcome and where violence could erupt suddenly. Chapter 6: Entertainment and Gambling. As the evening progressed in the medieval tavern, various forms of entertainment and gambling might emerge. The tavern was not just a place to drink and eat, it was a social center where people came to relax, to escape briefly from the hard labor and monotony of daily life. Let us examine the forms of entertainment you might witness or participate in during your visit. Music was a common form of entertainment in taverns. A traveling musician might be present, playing an instrument and singing songs for the entertainment of the patrons and in hopes of receiving coins or drinks. The instruments might include a lute, a harp, a recorder or other, simple flute, a drum, or a bagpipe. The music would be quite different from modern music, with modal scales and irregular rhythms that would sound strange to modern ears. The pew songs might be ballads telling stories of heroes and battles, religious songs, love songs, or ribald humorous songs, with crude lyrics. The quality of the music would vary greatly. A skilled and experienced minstrel might create beautiful music that would quiet the room and hold everyone's attention. A poor musician might produce discordant sounds that would be largely ignored or that would provoke jeering and thrown objects from the audience. Most musicians would fall somewhere in between, providing adequate background music that added to the atmosphere without being particularly memorable. In addition to professional musicians, amateur music making might occur. Someone in the crowd might have brought an instrument and might be persuaded to play, or people might simply begin singing together, perhaps work songs or popular tunes that everyone knew. This communal singing would be unpolished but enthusiastic, and it would create a sense of fellowship among the participants. You might be invited to join in, and your ability or inability to sing the local songs would immediately clash and mark you as an insider or an outsider. Storytelling was another form of entertainment. Someone with a gift of narrative might hold forth, telling tales of local history, ghost stories, legends of saints and miracles, or simply gossip about notable events in the community. The tavern would grow quiet as people listened, and there might be exclamations, questions, or commentary from the audience as the story progressed. A good storyteller was valued, and such a person might be given free drinks in exchange for their entertainment. Games and gambling would be popular pastimes in the tavern. Dice games were particularly common, as dice were easy to carry and easy to play. The games might be simple gambling games where players bet on the throw of the dice, or they might be more complex games with rules and strategy. Dice games could lead to disputes when someone thought they had been cheated or when someone refused to pay their debt. These disputes could escalate into violence, and the atmosphere around a dice game would often be tense and charged. Card games were becoming known in the later medieval period, though they were not as common as dice games. Playing cards were expensive, as they had to be handmade, and not all taverns would have a set available. If cards were present, games would be played for money, and the same potential for disputes and violence existed as with dice games. Board games might also be played. Chess was known among the educated classes, but it would be rare in a common tavern. Simpler games, like nine men's Morris or tables, an ancestor of backgammon, might be more common. These games would be played on boards carved into the table surface or drawn in chalk, with pieces made from whatever was at hand. Again, gambling would often be involved, with players betting on the outcome. Drinking games were popular, with various contests to determine who could drink the most or the fastest. These contests would be accompanied by much cheering and encouragement from onlookers. The winner would gain bragging rights and the respect of their peers, while the loser would be mocked. However, everyone involved would be thoroughly drunk by the end, and these games often ended with participants becoming sick or passing out. Fighting for entertainment might also occur. This might be formalized as wrestling matches or boxing matches with bets placed on the outcome. Or it might be less formal, simply two men agreeing to fight to settle an argument or to prove their toughness. These fights would be brutal, with no rules beyond perhaps an agreement not to use weapons. Blood would be spilled, teeth would be knocked out, bones might be broken. The crowd would gather around to watch, cheering on their favorites and placing bets. Animal baiting might occasionally be set up as entertainment, particularly in larger taverns or inns. This might involve setting dogs to attack a chained bear or bull, or having dogs fight each other, or having a rat baiting contest where a dog would be set loose in a pit full of rats and people would bet on how many rats it could kill in a given time. These blood sports were popular entertainment throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period. They would be considered cruel and disturbing by modern standards, but medieval people viewed them as acceptable amusement. Prostitutes would also be available in many taverns, and thus the solicitation and negotiation of sexual services would be a form of entertainment for some patrons. This might happen relatively openly, with prostitutes sitting at tables with potential clients and dull staff in co's discussing terms. Or it might happen, more discreetly, with negotiations conducted in quiet corners or through intermediaries. The tavern keeper might take a cut of the prostitute's earnings or might simply allow them to operate on the premises in exchange for buying drinks. All of these forms of entertainment would contribute to the rowdy, chaotic atmosphere of the tavern as the evening wore on. The noise level would increase, the inhibitions of the patrons would decrease as more ale was consumed, and the potential for disorder would grow. As an outsider, you would need to decide whether to participate in the entertainment, to simply observe, or to retire to a sleeping chamber if one was available. And if you had paid for lodging, participating in the gambling or games would be risky. As a stranger, you would be at a disadvantage, not knowing the local rules or customs. You might be cheated, and you would have little recourse. If you were, your money might be stolen in the chaos of a game, and if a dispute arose, you would have no allies to support you against the locals. On the other hand, successfully participating in games and entertainment might help you to be accepted by the locals, and might make your stay more pleasant. As the night progressed, some patrons would become quite drunk. Their behavior would become increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Some would become maudlin and emotional, perhaps weeping or expressing exaggerated affection for their companions. Others would become belligerent and aggressive, looking for any excuse to start a fight. Still others would simply become drowsy and would fall asleep where they sat, slumping over the table or sliding to the floor. The tavern keeper would eventually begin to encourage people to leave or to retire for the night. The fire would be allowed to die down, and the candles and lamps would be extinguished to save expense. The keeper would want to close up for the night and to get some sleep. Those who had paid for lodging would be shown to their sleeping chambers. Others would stumble out into the night to make their way home or to find somewhere else to sleep. Chapter 7. Sleeping Arrangements. If you had arranged to stay the night at the tavern, or if the tavern was part of an inn that provided lodging, you would now need to deal with the sleeping arrangements. The quality and nature of these arrangements would vary greatly depending on the type of establishment and how much you were willing and able to pay. Let us examine what you might encounter. First, you would need to negotiate with the tavern keeper or innkeeper for a place to sleep. This would involve specifying what type of accommodation you wanted and agreeing on a price. The options might include a private chamber, a shared room, or simply a spot on the floor of the common room or in the stable. The price would increase with the level of privacy and comfort provided. A private chamber would be the most expensive option and would only be available at larger inns. This would be a small room with a bed, perhaps some simple furniture, and a door that could be closed and possibly locked. However, even a private chamber would not provide the level of comfort or privacy that a modern person would expect, and a door that could be closed and possibly locked. However, even a private chamber would not provide the level of comfort or privacy that a modern person would expect. The bed would be a simple frame with ropes or leather straps stretched across it to support a mattress. The mattress would be a cloth sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. It would be lumpy and would not provide much support. The bedding would consist of coarse wool blankets that might or might not be clean. The room would be small and would have minimal ventilation. There might be a small window, but it would not have glass and would need to be shuttered at night to keep out the cold and to prevent someone from climbing in. The room would be cold in winter and stuffy in summer. There would be no heat source other than what warmth might seep through from the common room below or from adjacent rooms. There would be no heat source other than what warmth might seep through from the common room below or from adjacent rooms. There would be no lock on the door, or if there was a lock it would be a simple latch that could easily be forced. You would be alone in the room, which would be a significant advantage. You could secure your belongings as well as possible and could sleep without worrying too much about being robbed or assaulted by other lodgers. However, you would still hear noise from the common room below and from other rooms around you. The walls would be thin and sound would carry easily. You might hear snoring, coughing, talking, or other more intimate sounds from your neighbors. A shared room would be more common and more affordable. This would be a larger room with multiple beds or sleeping platforms. You might share the room with 3, 4, or even more other travelers. Each person would have their own bed or sleeping space, but the room would be crowded and there would be minimal privacy. You would be sleeping in the same room as strangers, which would create security concerns. You would need to sleep with your valuables on your person or hidden under your body to prevent them from being stolen while you slept. The other occupants of the room might be men of various sorts, fellow travelers, merchants, laborers, or individuals of questionable character. They might snore, they might smell bad, they might get up multiple times during the night to urinate in peace and plot, or to go outside. They might talk in their sleep, or might have nightmares and cry out. The combination of sounds, smells, and lack of privacy would make it difficult to sleep soundly. An even cheaper option would be to sleep in the common room of the tavern. Once the tavern closed for the night, those who had not paid for proper beds might be allowed to sleep on the floor, on the benches, or at the tables. You might spread your cloak on the floor and lie down on the rushes, using your pack as a pillow. This would provide minimal comfort, but would be very cheap, or might even be free if you had spent enough money on food and drink earlier. Sleeping in the common room would leave you completely exposed. Anyone could walk in during the night. Your belongings could be easily stolen. You would be cold, as the fire would be out or reduced to coals. The floor would be hard and uncomfortable. The rushes would be dirty and would harbor fleas, lice, and other vermin. You would almost certainly wake up with insect bites and would feel stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard surface. The worst option would be to sleep in the stable with the animals. This might be free or might cost a few coins. You would make a bed in the straw, finding a corner where you could lie down without being stepped on by a horse or kicked by a mule. The stable would be cold and would smell of animal urine and dung. The straw would be dirty and would contain parasites, but it would provide some shelter from the weather and would be better than sleeping outside in the cold and rain. Regardless of where you slept, you would need to take precautions to protect yourself and your belongings. You would sleep in your clothes, removing only your outer garments and perhaps your boots. You would keep your money and valuables in a pouch tied around your neck or hidden somewhere on your person. You would keep your knife within reach. You would try to position yourself in a corner or against a wall so that no one could approach you from behind without you knowing. The quality of sleep you would get would be poor. The bed or sleeping surface would be uncomfortable. The bedding would be insufficient to keep you warm. The noises would disturb you throughout the night. You might be awakened by someone coming or going, by someone snoring, by the sounds of rats or other animals, or by various other disturbances. You would doze fitfully, never falling into deep, restorative sleep. You would also need to worry about bedbugs. These insects were ubiquitous in medieval Europe and were a constant problem in inns and taverns, where many people slept. Bedbugs would hide in the cracks of the bed frame, in the mattress, and in the walls during the day, then would emerge at night to feed on the blood of sleeping people. Their bites would itch intensely and would leave red welts on your skin. There was no effective way to eliminate bedbugs, and you would simply have to accept that you would be bitten during the night. Fleas and lice would also be problems. These parasites would live in the bedding, in the floor, covering, and on the other occupants of the room. They would transfer to you during the night, and you would wake up with new parasites that would continue to plague you for days or weeks until you could properly clean yourself and your clothing. The constant itching and the knowledge that you were infested with vermin would be both uncomfortable and demoralizing. In the morning you would wake early, probably at dawn or shortly after, as there would be no reason to stay in bed once light appeared. If you were in a shared room or in the common room, there would be activity and noise as other people woke and began preparing for the day. You would need to gather your belongings quickly and check to make sure nothing had been stolen during the night. You would put on any outer garments you had removed, put on your boots, and prepare to leave. There would be no breakfast included with your lodging. If you wanted to eat, you would need to order and pay for food separately. You might request bread and ale to break your fast, or you might simply move on to your next destination, planning to eat later at another tavern or from provisions you carried with you. You would pay the innkeeper for your lodging before you left. The price would depend on what type of accommodation you had used and on the innkeeper's assessment of how much they thought they could charge you. If you appeared wealthy, the price might be inflated. If you appeared poor, you might be charged the minimum or might be allowed to stay free if business had been slow. You would count out the coins carefully and hand them over, making sure you received any change that was due, which might or might not be forthcoming. Then you would leave the tavern and continue on your way, carrying with you the memories of your experience. The smells, the sounds, the tastes, the sights, the discomforts, and perhaps a few new parasites as unwanted souvenirs. The visit to the medieval tavern would have been a necessary part of your journey, a place to rest and refuel. But it would not have been pleasant or comfortable by modern standards. It would have been simply another hardship to endure in the difficult business of traveling in the medieval world. Chapter 8: Dangers and Challenges of Tavern Life. Let us examine, in more detail, the various dangers and challenges that would confront someone visiting a medieval tavern. While we have touched on some of these issues already, it is worth exploring them more thoroughly to fully understand why the medieval tavern experience would be so difficult for a modern person to endure. Theft would be a constant concern. Taverns attracted thieves because they attracted people with money. A traveler might be carrying the proceeds from selling goods, a merchant might have coins from recent transactions, even a common laborer might have their week's wages. In the crowded, chaotic environment of the tavern, with many people drinking and becoming careless, opportunities for theft were abundant. A skilled pickpocket could easily work a crowded tavern, cutting purses from belts or slipping hands into pockets while victims were distracted. You would need to be constantly alert, keeping your hand on your purse, or keeping it tucked inside your clothing where it could not be easily accessed. Even so, a determined and practiced thief might be able to relieve you of your money before you noticed. If you became drunk or fell asleep, you would be particularly vulnerable, and you might wake to find yourself robbed of everything. The tavern keeper or staff might also steal from customers. This might involve shortchanging you when making change, watering down the ale while still charging full price, or rifling through your belongings while you slept. You would have little recourse if you suspected you had been cheated, as it would be your word against the keepers, and the keeper would have the support of the local community while you would be an outsider. Violence was another ever-present danger. As mentioned earlier, arguments and fights would break out regularly in taverns. These might start over gambling, disputes, over perceived insults, over women, or over nothing at all beyond excessive drinking and male aggression. Even if you were not directly involved in a fight, you might be caught up in it if you were nearby when it started. Tables might be overturned, spilling food and drink. Benches might be used as weapons. Knives might be drawn. Serious injuries or even deaths could result from tavern brawls. A punch might break bones or cause someone to fall and hit their head. A knife wound could be fatal, especially given the poor state of medieval medicine. If you were injured in a tavern fight, you would receive, given the poor state of medieval medicine. If you were injured in a tavern fight, you would receive minimal medical attention, and you would be responsible for your own care and recovery. No one would compensate you for your injuries or lost wages while you recovered. As an outsider, you would be at particular risk. If a fight broke out between locals, they might all turn on you as a stranger and a convenient target. Or you might simply be accused of causing trouble and thrown out into the street, or worse. The locals would support each other against outsiders, and you would have no allies to defend you. This would make it essential to avoid any situation that might lead to conflict. Sexual assault would be a risk, particularly for women. A woman traveling alone or a woman working in the tavern would be vulnerable to unwanted advances and assault. The combination of alcohol, male aggression, and lack of legal protections for women meant that sexual violence was common. Even a woman traveling with male companions might not be entirely safe, as groups of drunk men might overpower a small traveling party. Disease would be another danger. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of the tavern would facilitate the spread of infectious diseases. Respiratory infections would pass easily from person to person in the close quarters. Diseases of the digestive system would spread through contaminated food and water, and through the shared use of eating and drinking vessels that were not properly cleaned. Parasites including lice, fleas, and bedbugs would infest the bedding, and would be transferred from one customer to the next. Some diseases could be fatal. Typhoid fever, dysentery, plague, and various other illnesses circulated through medieval populations, and crowded public spaces, like taverns, were ideal environments for transmission. If you stayed in a tavern where someone was sick, you might become infected without knowing it, until symptoms appeared days later. By fall, then you might be far from any help, and you would have to deal with the illness as best you could. Food poisoning would be a common occurrence. The lack of refrigeration, the poor understanding of poor hygiene, and the practice of keeping pottage simmering for days meant that food could easily become contaminated with harmful bacteria. Meat and fish that had begun to spoil might still be served, as the smell and taste could be masked with strong seasonings, or simply because the cook did not realize the food was bad. Eating contaminated food would result in severe gastrointestinal distress, including vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. In severe cases, it could be fatal. The ale itself could be contaminated or adulterated. Unscrupulous tavern keepers might water down their ale to increase profits, or they might brew it carelessly, resulting in contaminated or spoiled ale. Drinking bad ale could make you sick, though ironically the alcohol content meant that ale was often safer to drink than water, which could be severely contaminated with sewage and other pollutants. Fire was a constant danger. The open flames used for cooking, heating, and lighting, combined with the wooden construction of most taverns, created a significant fire risk. A careless moment could start a blaze that would quickly engulf the building. If you were sleeping in an upper room and a fire started below, you might be trapped, as there would be only one stairway, and the smoke would rise to fill the upper floors first. Many people died in fires at inns and taverns throughout the medieval period. The legal situation would also be precarious. If you were involved in any sort of trouble at the tavern, whether as perpetrator or victim, you would face the medieval legal system, which was quite different from modern law. There would be no police to investigate objectively. Justice would be administered by local officials who might be corrupt or biased. If you were a foreigner or an outsider, you would be at a significant disadvantage. You might be arrested, fined, or punished simply because you were convenient and the locals wanted someone to blame. If you were robbed, you would have little hope of recovering your property. There would be no detectives to track down the thief, no forensic methods to identify the perpetrator. You would simply have lost your money and possessions, and that would be the end of it. This would be devastating if you were robbed of all your money, as it would leave you unable to pay for food or lodging, and unable to continue your journey. You might be reduced to begging or to working for food and shelter until you could accumulate enough resources to move on. The psychological stress of dealing with all these dangers would be considerable. You would need to remain alert at all times, watching for threats, protecting your belongings, avoiding trouble. The constant vigilance would be exhausting, and the inability to fully relax would prevent you from getting adequate rest. Even when you tried to sleep, you would sleep lightly, ready to wake at any sound or disturbance. This chronic stress and sleep deprivation would wear you down over time. Chapter 9. Leaving the tavern. When your visit to the tavern concluded, whether after a few hours of rest and refreshment or after spending the night, you would need to prepare to leave and continue on your journey, or return to your home. Let us examine this process and the final impressions you would take away from the medieval tavern experience. In the morning, if you had stayed overnight, you would wake in discomfort. Your body would ache from the inadequate bedding. Your skin would itch from insect bites. Your mouth would be dry, and you would have a headache if you had drunk too much ale the night before. You would feel groggy and unrested, despite having spent hours lying down, because the quality of your sleep would have been so poor. You would gather your belongings, checking carefully to make sure nothing had been stolen during the night. You would shake out your cloak and clothing to dislodge any fleas or other insects. You would put on any items you had removed before sleeping. You would check your purse to count your remaining money and to plan how you would pay for any additional food or services before you left. If you had stored your horse or pack animal in the stable, you would need to retrieve it and pay the stable charges. You would inspect the animal to make sure it had been properly cared for and to check for any injuries or problems. You would need to load your packs or baggage onto the animal, making sure everything was properly secured for travel. This process would take some time, and you would be impatient to get on the road, but would need to be thorough to avoid problems later. You might order a quick breakfast before leaving, perhaps just bread and ale, or you might decide to wait until you reach the next town or village to eat. If you did eat, you would do so quickly, standing or sitting at a table in the common room, which would now be much quieter than it had been the previous evening. Other travelers who had stayed the night would also be preparing to leave, and there would be a general atmosphere of people hurrying to get on with their business. You would pay your final bill to the tavern keeper, settling accounts for any food, drink, or lodging that had not yet been paid for. The keeper would calculate what you owed, and you might need to negotiate if you felt the charges were excessive. However, as a stranger with no local standing, you would have little leverage, and you would likely end up paying whatever the keeper demanded rather than starting an argument that might delay your departure or cause trouble. With your business concluded, you would finally leave the tavern and step out into the morning. The fresh air would be welcome after the smoky, stuffy interior of the building. You would take a deep breath and feel relieved to be out in the open again. However, you would also face the prospect of another day of hard travel, walking or riding along rough roads, exposed to the weather, with uncertain prospects for where you would find your next meal or place to rest. As you walked or rode away from the tavern, you would reflect on your experience. You would remember the discomforts, the poor quality of the food and drink, the dirty and crowded conditions, the noise and smell, the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, the constant for where you would find your next meal or place to rest. As you walked or rode away from the tavern, you would reflect on your experience. You would remember the discomforts, the poor quality of the food and drink, the dirty and crowded conditions, the noise and smell, the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, the constant threat of theft or violence. You would feel relieved to have survived the night without serious incident. You would be glad to be on your way, even though the road ahead would bring its own challenges. But you would also recognize that the tavern had served its purpose. It had provided shelter from the weather, a place to rest, food and drink, and an opportunity to gather information from other travelers about road conditions and dangers ahead. Despite all its shortcomings, the medieval tavern was an essential institution, one of the few places where travelers could find even basic accommodations in a world where travel was difficult and dangerous. If you were a modern person somehow transported to the medieval period, the experience of visiting a tavern would be deeply uncomfortable and disturbing. Everything about it would violate your expectations and standards. The dirt, the smells, the poor quality of the food and drink, the lack of privacy, the constant threats to your safety and property, the parasites, the cold or heat, the noise, the general roughness and crudeness of the experience would all combine to make you desperate to return to the modern world where cleanliness, comfort, and safety are taken for granted. You would realize how much you had always taken for granted. Clean water from a tap, hot showers, comfortable beds with clean sheets, climate control, electric lighting, refrigerated food, restaurants with health inspections, hotels with locks on the doors, police to call if there was trouble. All of these modern conveniences would seem like impossible luxuries. You would understand viscerally how hard life was in the medieval period, how much effort and discomfort were required just to accomplish basic tasks, like eating a meal and getting a night's sleep. The medieval tavern was not designed for comfort or pleasure. It was designed for functionality, to meet basic needs in the most economical way possible. The people who ran taverns were not trying to provide hospitality in the modern sense. They were trying to make a living by selling food and drink and renting space for people to sleep. The customers were not expecting a pleasant experience. They were simply trying to survive their journeys and to have some social interaction and entertainment in their otherwise hard and monotonous lives. Understanding this helps us appreciate both how much progress has been made and how different the medieval mindset was from our own. Medieval people accepted discomfort, danger, and hardship as normal parts of life. They did not expect things to be pleasant or convenient. They did not complain about dirty floors or uncomfortable beds because they knew nothing better existed. Their expectations were calibrated to their reality, and within that reality, a functioning tavern that provided adequate food, drink, and shelter was a good thing, something to be grateful for. We, on the other hand, have been so thoroughly shaped by modernity that we can barely imagine accepting the conditions that medieval people lived with daily. Our expectations for comfort, convenience, safety, and cleanliness are so high that a medieval tavern would seem like a nightmare to us. We would be constantly uncomfortable, constantly anxious, constantly wishing we could leave and return to the world. We know this exploration of what it was like to visit a medieval tavern has revealed a world that is both fascinating and deeply alien to modern experience. It was a world where the most basic activities required effort and involved discomfort. It was a world where danger was ever present and where life was hard for almost everyone. It was a world we can study and try to understand, but one we would not want to actually experience. Chapter 10: The Economics of the Tavern. To fully understand the medieval tavern experience, we must examine the economic aspects of how taverns operated and how costs were calculated. This will help us appreciate the challenges faced both by tavern keepers trying to make a living and by customers trying to afford food, drink, and lodging on limited resources. The tavern keeper's business model was straightforward but challenging. They needed to purchase or produce the ale, acquire food supplies, maintain the building, and somehow make enough profit from selling these goods and services to support themselves and their families. The profit margins were often thin, and many tavern keepers struggled to make ends meet, especially in small villages where customer volume was low. Ale production was the foundation of the tavern business. Most taverns brewed their own ale on the premises, though some purchased ale from Cajun professional brewers. The process of brewing required grain, which had to be purchased or grown. Barley was the preferred grain for brewing, though wheat, oats, or other grains might be used, depending on availability and cost. The grain needed to be malted, which meant soaking it until it sprouted, then drying it in a kiln. This process required time, labor, and fuel for the kiln. The malted grain would then be ground and mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid called wort. This wort would be strained and allowed to ferment with the addition of yeast, though medieval brewers did not understand yeast as a living organism. They simply knew that adding the foam or sediment from a previous batch would cause the new batch to ferment. The fermentation would take several days, after which the ale would be ready to drink. The cost of producing ale included the cost of grain, the cost of fuel for heating water and drying malt, the cost of vessels and equipment, and the cost of labor. All of these costs needed to be recovered through the sale of the ale, plus enough additional to provide profit. However, the price that could be charged was limited by what customers could afford and by local regulations that sometimes set maximum prices for ale. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale, first established in 1266, attempted to regulate the price and quality of these essential commodities. Ale was supposed to be sold at a price that was fair given the cost of grain, and ale that was of poor quality or short measure could result in fines for the brewer. Enforcement of these regulations was inconsistent, but they did place some limits on how much profit tavern keepers could extract from customers. Food costs were similarly challenging to manage. Pottage could be made relatively cheaply from vegetables, grains, and small amounts of meat, but the quality would suffer if the cheapest ingredients were used. Better quality food required better ingredients, which cost more money. The tavern keeper needed to balance the desire to serve food that would attract customers against the need to keep costs low enough to make a profit. Meat was expensive, and including substantial amounts of meat in the pottage or serving roasted meat would significantly increase the food cost. Fish was somewhat cheaper than meat, but fresh fish had to be used quickly before it spoiled, and salted fish, while it kept longer, was not particularly appetizing. Vegetables and grains were the cheapest ingredients, but a pottage that was mostly vegetables and grain would be bland and would not satisfy customers who wanted something more substantial. Bread was another essential item that needed to be available. Many taverns baked their own bread, which required purchasing grain, grinding it into flour, and tending an oven. The cost of fuel for the oven was significant, especially in areas where wood was scarce. The bread needed to be of reasonable quality, or customers would complain, but making high-quality bread required expensive wheat flour rather than cheaper barley or rye. The building itself required maintenance and repairs. The thatch roof would need to be replaced periodically, perhaps every 10 to 20 years depending on the quality of the thatch and the weather conditions. The wattle and daub walls would deteriorate and would need to be replaced. The floor covering of rushes or straw would need to be changed regularly. Furniture would wear out and need to be replaced. All of these maintenance costs had to be paid for from the tavern's revenue. Fuel for heating and cooking was another significant expense. Wood had to be purchased or gathered, and in areas where forests had been cleared for farmland, wood could be expensive. The tavern needed to keep a fire burning most of the time for heating, cooking, and providing light, which required a steady supply of fuel. Coal was becoming more common in some areas by the later medieval period, but it was not universally available and had its own costs. Lighting was expensive. Candles were made from tallow or beeswax, both of which cost money. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheaper, but produced a lot of smoke and had an unpleasant smell. Beeswax candles were cleaner burning, but were much more expensive. Oil lamps required oil, typically olive oil or other vegetable oils, which also had to be purchased. Most taverns used lighting sparingly to keep costs down, which is why the interiors were so dim. The tavern keeper also needed to worry about theft and fraud. Customers might leave without paying, especially if they became drunk and forgot, or if they deliberately decided to cheat the keeper. Ale and food could be stolen by staff or by customers. Money could be stolen from the tavern's cash box. Suppliers might deliver short measure or poor quality goods. All of these losses had to be absorbed by the tavern keeper, eating into whatever profit there might be. Regulations and taxes were another burden. In England, anyone who brewed ale for sale was supposed to be registered with the local manor court and was supposed to pay taxes on the ale sold. Failure to register or to pay taxes could result in fines. The tavern keeper also needed to maintain good relations with local authorities, as complaints about disorder, watered ale, or other problems could result in the tavern being shut down. Given all these costs and challenges, tavern keepers needed to carefully manage their pricing. A cup of ale might cost a halfpenny or a penny, depending on the strength and quality. A meal might cost anywhere from a penny to several pence, depending on what was served. A night's lodging might cost a few pence for a spot on the floor to several pence for a bed in a shared room to a shilling or more for a private chamber. These prices sound quite cheap by modern standards, but they represented significant portions of a medieval laborer's daily wage. A typical laborer in medieval England might earn 2 to 4 pence per day, though wages varied by region, time period, and type of work. Spending a penny on ale and another penny on food would consume half or more of a day's wages. Adding in the cost of lodging would make a night at a tavern a significant expense. This is why many travelers tried to minimize their tavern expenses by sleeping outdoors when weather permitted or by carrying their own provisions, rather than purchasing meals. For the tavern keeper, the profit from each transaction might be quite small. After paying quint for all the costs of ingredients, fuel, maintenance, taxes, and labor, there might be only a small margin left as profit. The keeper needed volume of sales to make a decent living, which meant attracting and retaining customers in competition with other taverns and alehouses. This created pressure to keep prices low and quality adequate, while somehow still making enough money to survive. The seasonal variation in business also affected tavern economics. In summer, when days were long and weather was good, more travelers would be on the roads, and tavern business would be relatively brisk. In winter, when days were short and weather was harsh, travel decreased dramatically and tavern business would slow. The keeper needed to make enough money during the busy seasons to survive through the slow seasons, which required careful financial management. Harvest time was often a busy period for taverns, as farm workers would have money in their pockets from harvest wages and would celebrate the completion of the harvest by drinking. Religious festivals and market days would also bring increased business, as people gathered for these events would need food and drink. A smart tavern keeper would locate their establishment along a well-traveled road or near a market town to maximize potential custom. Understanding these economic realities helps explain why the quality of tavern food and accommodations was generally poor. Tavern keepers were not necessarily cheating their customers or providing poor service out of malice. They were simply operating on very thin margins and could not afford to provide high-quality goods and services at prices that ordinary people could afford. The medieval tavern was a low-margin, high-volume business that provided basic necessities at the cheapest possible prices. Chapter 11. Social Customs and Etiquette. To successfully navigate a visit to a medieval tavern, one would need to understand and follow the social customs and etiquette that governed behavior in these establishments. These customs were generally unwritten but were well understood by medieval people. A modern person would need to learn them quickly to avoid causing offense or marking themselves as ignorant outsiders. Greeting customs were important. When entering a tavern, you might greet the company in general with a phrase like "God give you good evening," or simply "God be with you." This would acknowledge the presence of others and would mark you as a polite person. Ignoring the other patrons completely would be seen as rude or arrogant. However, you would not need to greet each person individually unless you knew them. If you knew someone in the tavern, you would greet them more specifically and might join them at their table. This would be the normal way to begin socializing. Sitting at a table with strangers without invitation or excuse would be acceptable if the tavern was crowded and space was limited. But you would typically ask permission first, saying something like, "May I join you?" or "Is this seat taken?" This courtesy would help prevent disputes. Toasting and drinking customs were important. When drinking with others, it was customary to toast them, saying "wassail" or "to your health" or similar phrases. You would raise your cup, make eye contact, and vend then drink. The others would respond in kind. Refusing to drink with someone who had offered you a toast could be seen as an insult. However, you would need to be careful, as some people might try to get you drunk by constantly proposing toasts that you felt obligated to honor. Sharing food and drink was a sign of friendship and goodwill. If you were eating and someone joined your table, you might offer them some of your food or drink. They might decline politely, or they might accept and vend, would be expected to reciprocate in some way, perhaps by buying the next round of ale. This reciprocity was important in medieval social relationships. Accepting hospitality without offering anything in return would mark you as a cheapskate or a freeloader. Conversation topics were generally limited to practical matters, local gossip, storytelling, and discussion of current events. Politics could be dangerous to discuss, as criticizing the king or local lords might be considered seditious and could get you into serious trouble if someone reported you. Religious matters could also be sensitive, as heresy was taken very seriously. You would generally want to stick to safe topics and to avoid saying anything that might be controversial or offensive. Swearing and cursing were common in tavern conversation, but you needed to be careful about the nature of your oaths. Swearing by God, by the saints, or by Christ was extremely common, but excessive or casual use of such oaths could be seen as blasphemous. There were also laws against blasphemy that could result in fines or punishment. However, medieval people swore constantly, often without thinking, so you would need to strike a balance between fitting in and not going too far. Physical contact in conversation was more common than in modern Western culture. Men might clap each other on the shoulder, grab each other's arms for emphasis, or stand closer together when talking. This was normal and was not seen as invading personal space in the way it might be today. However, you would need to be alert to signs that someone was becoming aggressive, as friendly physical contact could quickly escalate into violence if someone felt insulted or threatened. Paying for drinks and food involved certain customs. If you were drinking with a group, it was expected that people would take turns buying rounds. If you allowed others to always pay while you never reciprocated, you would quickly develop a bad reputation. However, if you were clearly poor and could not afford to buy rounds, this might be understood and forgiven, especially if you were known in the community. As a stranger, you would be expected to pay your full share. Tipping was not a common practice in the same way it is today, but giving extra coins to servers or to the tavern keeper for good service would be appreciated and might result in better treatment on future visits. However, this would only be expected from wealthy customers. Common folk would not be expected to give more than the basic price for food and drink. The treatment of tavern staff required attention. Servers and tavern workers were often women or young people from poor families. They might be daughters of the tavern keeper, or they might be hired help. They would be subject to harassment and abuse from customers, and this was generally tolerated as part of tavern life. However, physically harming a tavern worker or severely interfering with their ability to do their job might result in the tavern keeper throwing you out. If you were sexually interested in a tavern worker, you would need to be careful about how you express this. Crude verbal advances might be tolerated, but attempting to force yourself on someone would cross a line and might result in violence from the tavern keeper or from other patrons. If prostitutes were present, they would make it clear that they were available, and negotiations would be straightforward. Confusing a regular tavern worker with a prostitute could cause serious offense. Disputes and arguments were common, and there were informal rules about how these should be handled. Verbal arguments were acceptable and were even seen as entertainment by CTA onlookers. However, there was a point at which words might lead to violence. Certain insults were particularly inflammatory, especially those that impugned someone's honor, questioned their parentage, or accused them of cowardice or dishonesty. You would need to be careful about what you said, as even a casual comment might be taken as a serious insult. If a dispute seemed likely to turn violent, others in the tavern might intervene to calm things down, or might take sides based on their relationships with the disputants. As a stranger, you would want to stay out of local disputes unless you were directly involved. Taking the wrong side in an argument could make you many enemies and could result in you being attacked or driven out of town. If violence did break out, the appropriate response would depend on your relationship to the combatants. If two locals were fighting and you were not involved, you would stay out of the way and let them settle their dispute. If you were attacked, you would need to defend yourself, but you would want to avoid using excessive force that might result in serious injury or death, as this could have legal consequences. The line between acceptable self-defense and criminal assault was not always clear, and much would depend on local customs and on the sympathies of witnesses. Leaving the tavern had its own customs. If you were leaving before most others, you might simply get up and go without ceremony. If you were leaving at the end of the evening when the tavern was closing, you might bid the company good night with a general farewell. If you had been drinking with particular companions, you would take leave of them more specifically. Sneaking out without paying would mark you as a thief and might result in you being pursued and caught. All of these social customs and expectations would be second nature to medieval people, but would be completely foreign to a modern person. You would constantly be making small errors that would mark you as strange or foreign. Some of these errors would be forgiven or overlooked, especially if you were clearly a traveler from a distant place. But accumulating too many social missteps could result in you being ostracized, cheated, or even attacked. The medieval tavern was a social space with its own complex rules, and navigating it successfully required knowledge that could only be gained through experience. Chapter 12. Seasonal variations in tavern life. The experience of visiting a medieval tavern would vary significantly depending on the season of the year. Weather conditions, agricultural cycles, religious observances, and the availability of different foods and drinks all changed with the seasons, and these changes affected every aspect of tavern life. Let us examine how each season would present different conditions and challenges. In winter, the tavern would be a refuge from the cold and dark. The fire would burn constantly, providing warmth and light. Customers would crowd around the fire, competing for the warmest spots. The tavern would be full in the evenings, as people sought warmth and companionship during the long dark nights. However, business might be slow overall, as travel was difficult in winter, weather, and many people simply stayed home. The food in winter would consist primarily of preserved items. Fresh vegetables would not be available, so the pottage would be made from stored grains, dried peas or beans, and root vegetables like turnips and onions that could be stored in cellars. Meat would be salted or smoked, giving it a strong flavor and making it quite salty. Fresh meat might occasionally be available if an animal was slaughtered, but this would be a special occasion rather than a regular offering. The ale brewed in winter would benefit from the cooler temperatures, which helped control the fermentation process. However, the cold also meant that fermentation would proceed more slowly, and it might be more difficult to maintain the right temperature for brewing. The ale would generally be good quality in winter, though the cold temperatures might make it less appealing to drink. Many customers would prefer hot drinks in winter, and taverns might offer warmed ale or wine spiced with ginger, cinnamon, or other warming spices. The sleeping arrangements in winter would be particularly uncomfortable. The bedrooms would be freezing cold, as there would be no heat source other than what warmth might drift up from the fire below. You would sleep fully clothed under heavy wool blankets, and you would still be cold. Your breath would form clouds in the frigid air. Any water left out would freeze. In the morning, you would be stiff and miserable, and it would take considerable willpower to get up and face the cold day ahead. In spring, the tavern would begin to come alive again as the weather improved and people ventured out more. Spring was a time of renewed activity after the dormancy of winter. Fields needed to be plowed and planted, and this work brought people together. The tavern would be busy with workers stopping in for refreshment after long days of labor. The mood would be hopeful as people looked forward to the coming growing season. The food in spring would begin to improve as fresh greens became available. Early spring, vegetables like leeks and the first tender greens could be added to the pottage. However, spring was also a time of scarcity, as the stored food from the previous harvest was running low and the new harvest was still months away. This period, sometimes called the hungry gap, could be difficult and food supplies might be limited. The tavern keeper might struggle to provide adequate meals and prices might rise due to scarcity. The ale supply might also be problematic in spring, as the ale brewed in winter would be running low and fresh ale would need to be brewed frequently to keep up with demand. The warmer temperatures of spring would make ale spoil more quickly, so batches would need to be smaller and fresher. The quality might be variable as brewers adjusted to the changing conditions. In summer, the tavern would be hot and uncomfortable. The fire would still need to be kept burning for cooking, making the interior stifling. Customers would seek out the cooler spots near doors and windows, trying to catch any breeze. The smell would be particularly strong in summer, as heat intensified all the various odors. Flies would be everywhere, landing on food and drink, crawling on tables and walls, and generally being a constant annoyance. The food in summer would be at its best, as fresh vegetables would be abundant and meat would not need to be preserved. The pottage could include fresh peas, beans, cabbage, onions, and herbs. Fresh meat from recently slaughtered animals would be available, though it would need to be consumed quickly before it spoiled in the heat. Fruit would begin to appear, with early summer fruits like cherries and later summer fruits like plums and apples. The ale in summer would be challenging to manage. The warm temperatures would cause fermentation to proceed quickly, and ale would spoil rapidly. Tavern keepers would need to brew small batches frequently and would need to sell the ale quickly before it turned sour. Customers might complain about the quality, especially if the ale was too warm or if it had begun to sour. Small ale with its lower alcohol content would be popular in summer as a refreshing drink that would not cause excessive intoxication in the heat. Travel in summer was at its peak as roads were dry and daylight hours were long. The tavern would be busy with travelers passing through, creating a lively and sometimes chaotic atmosphere. Competition for beds would be fierce, and you might have trouble finding accommodations unless you arrived early. The tavern keeper could charge higher prices in summer due to the increased demand. In autumn, the tavern would benefit from the harvest bounty. Fresh grain, vegetables, and fruit would be abundant. The pottage would be rich and varied, with the best ingredients of the year. Meat from animals slaughtered in preparation for winter would be available. The mood in the tavern would be celebratory, as people were relieved to have completed the harvest and were ready to relax and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Ale brewed in autumn would be of high quality, made from fresh grain and benefiting from the moderate temperatures that were ideal for fermentation. This ale would be strong and flavorful, and it would be consumed enthusiastically at harvest celebrations. The tavern would be busy with harvest workers who had earned wages and wanted to spend them on food and drink. However, autumn was also a time when people needed to prepare for winter. Surplus food needed to be preserved, repairs needed to be made before weather arrived, and firewood needed to be collected. The tavern keeper would be busy with these preparations, in addition to serving customers. The long-term success of the tavern depended on planning ahead and making sure supplies would be adequate to survive the winter months when business would be slow. Understanding these seasonal variations helps us appreciate how different the medieval experience was from modern life. We live in a world where seasons have minimal impact on our daily activities. We can buy fresh produce year-round. Climate control keeps our buildings comfortable regardless of outside temperature, and business operations continue at the same pace all year. Medieval people had to constantly adapt to changing seasonal conditions, and every aspect of life, including a simple visit to a tavern, was shaped by what time of year it was. And now, dear listener, as you contemplate the medieval tavern in all its uncomfortable, smelly, dangerous, and fascinating reality, you can drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that you will wake in the modern world, where taverns and bars are clean, well-lit, temperature-controlled spaces, with health inspections, locks on the doors, and no bedbugs in the beds. You will never need to visit a medieval tavern, and for that you can be profoundly grateful. Sleep well and good night.